Once she and I had a long discussion on what it meant to be famous. And she said to me, would you like to be famous? And I said, no, I really wouldn't. And she said, you're very wise, you know. She said, it's cost me a lot. All those awful hotels, the traveling, and the loneliness. And she said, the days are all right. You're surrounded with all kinds of people. But the nights are so lonely, and it is so terrible. And that was one of the times where I felt very close to her indeed, and knew that she really paid a terrible price. But I don't think she would have done it differently if she had to do it all over again. I think she enjoyed what she was able to accomplish.
In November of 1978, Margaret Mead dies. According to a poll, she's one of the 3 best-known women in American history. Internationally celebrated, she had become, in the words of Time magazine, mother to the world. The book that has made her famous is Coming of Age in Samoa, on which she begins work at the age of 23. In it, she announces her sensational discovery of a Polynesian culture free of the stresses of adolescence, a place of free love and harmony. Here, children sail painlessly and effortlessly into adulthood in a lush tropical setting. The book becomes a classic and has a profound effect on future generations of Americans who strive to emulate its findings. In 1940, another 23-year-old, Derek Freeman, arrives in Samoa aboard a banana boat out of Wellington, New Zealand. He is a fervent believer in Mead's Samoa, whose account he has read and reread. He's taking up his new post as a schoolteacher in Apia. Awaiting him, he is sure, is the island paradise whose description has so captivated him. But instead, he finds that Margaret Mead's Samoa is largely make-believe. He encounters a puritanical people obsessed by rank, among whom aggression is commonplace. After collecting evidence for 40 years, he publishes his refutation of Mead's conclusions, an academic bombshell. The result is the greatest controversy in the history of anthropology, the science of humankind. A controversy that will be resolved by startling new evidence presented in this program.
Well, my mother, Margaret Mead, grew up in Pennsylvania in an academic household. Her parents met as graduate students at the University of Chicago, and her father was a professor of economics, and her mother was a sociologist who never quite finished her PhD, but went on doing research even while she had 4 children.
From the age of 4, she was a very forceful, dominant person. She was told as a little child repeatedly, apparently, that there is no one like Margaret. And this was a notion that she accepted and lived by all of her life. Indeed, there was no one like Margaret. She was always very, very sure of herself.
She interested me the more I looked into her, because I think I began to understand the things that drove her, because she was a driven woman, as I see her.
What do you think drove her then?
I think there were a number of things. I think the first thing is that she was a very plain girl. And she never forgot that she was a very plain girl, so that she had to overcompensate for being plain. Then she never really belonged. Her family kept moving when she was a child. So she was always the odd kid out at school. And she had this terrific need to be accepted. To feel that she belonged somewhere.
All her life, Margaret Mead has been looking for a mentor, and at Columbia University she finds Franz Boas, the father of American anthropology, and his assistant, Ruth Benedict.
Ruth Benedict was an unhappily married woman who had done a number of things but had never found fulfillment in any professional connection. She had written poetry and tried other avenues, but she had discovered anthropology and loved it and thought that this at last was the discipline she'd been looking for. And she said she wanted to have a companion in harness. And in young Margaret Mead, an undergraduate studying the same discipline, she found that. And they became very loving friends.
I remember her as very beautiful and very, very gracious as a person. Now, when I came to write about my mother, after her death, I learned that she had had an intimate relationship with Ruth for long periods of time that was somehow enclosed within the friendship and the colleagueship.
Her problem then became, where should she go to do the work that would lead to her dissertation? Well, then an obvious answer would have been an American Indian tribe, but that had already been done. Everybody did that. Many anthropologists. There were jokes that the average American Indian family consisted of mother, father, child, and anthropologist. So she wanted to go where few people had gone before.
For her first field trip, Margaret Mead's heart is set on some remote and beautiful South Sea island. Boas asks her to investigate a specific question, which he phrases, "Are the difficulties of adolescent girls due to the physiological changes which take place at puberty, or to the civilization in which they grow up?" Boas hopes that Margaret Mead's answer will help him in his battle with the eugenicists, those scientists who believe that the human race can be improved by selective breeding. This is the so-called nature versus nurture controversy, which rages during the 1920s and in which Mead herself is much involved.
I didn't even want to study the adolescent girl. I wanted to study change. My professor wanted me to study adolescence. I wanted to come to Polynesia somewhere. He wanted me to stay in the United States. So we made an exchange. He said I could come to Polynesia if I'd study the adolescent girl.
In August 1925, Margaret Mead departs for Samoa, leaving a young husband, Luther Cressman, waiting. Nobody pays special attention to Mead at the ramshackle hotel in Pango Pango, which Somerset Maugham has made famous, and for the next 10 weeks she studies the Samoan language. She finds the main island too Americanised and decides to move to the small and remote island of Ta'u, one of 3 islands in the Manua group, 70 miles to the east. There she lives with an American family, the Holts, at the Naval Dispensary. And it is from here that her study of 25 adolescent girls begins.
Now, I did write, in a sense, for the Samoans. That is, I concealed every name of anyone about whose private life I said anything. And nobody's ever been able to work it out, thank goodness. Sometimes that makes them accuse me of things. But I concealed people's identity well enough. When Dr. Holmes was there, he wrote me and said, "I can't identify your informants. Please send me a list." Because I protected people enough so that I never revealed the personality of anyone, the identity of anyone.
One reason that Samoans do not have sexual problems, Mead reports, is that they never get deeply involved with their sexual partners. Sexual fidelity is rated as a matter of days or weeks at most. In fact, Mead claims, Samoans have no intense feelings about anything. There is no strong bond between parents and children, the society is not competitive, and no natural disasters threaten the people. Finally, at the end of her book, she concludes that the behaviour of the Samoans can be explained only in terms other than biological, thereby claiming the environment, or nurture, to be all-important. She completes her study of Samoan adolescents in less than 5 months, and in May 1926 departs for New York to publish her findings.
I think the fascination of the book was its focus on sex, idealized sex, and America was at a stage where it was becoming sex-obsessed, and she catered really to that. Listen to this passage. Familiarity with sex and the recognition of a need of a technique to deal with sex as an art have produced a scheme of personal relations in which there are no neurotic pictures, no frigidity, no impotence except as a temporary result of severe illness. And the capacity for intercourse only once in a night is counted as senility. I mean, who could possibly have fallen for that stuff?
Mead's conclusion that adolescent behaviour is culturally determined is big news for anthropology and very much what Boas wants to hear. The book becomes a triumph for his ideas and the American belief in human perfectibility. The enormous success of the book immediately thrusts Mead into prominence in American intellectual life, a position she will occupy for the next half-century. Although she never again studies Samoa or revises her work, the die is cast. Before arriving in Samoa in 1940, Derek Freeman has already established a reputation as a radical among his fellow university students.
When I was a student at Victoria University College in Wellington, New Zealand, I worked in the seminar of Ernst Spiegelhal, who was a personal friend of Margaret Mead's, and he introduced me to anthropology and to Margaret Mead's work, and in particular taught us that this book, which was then already well known, was of great anthropological significance. Samoa was then an isolated place. It took 13 days by ship from New Zealand to get there, and very few Samoans had been out of the islands. I had a horse and I used to ride over the mountains on the island to this remote village where I worked, and every available moment was spent studying the Samoans. During my first 2 years in Samoa, while I was learning the language, my base was in a village called Sa'anapu, and I stayed there with the family of the senior talking chief in this village. One morning, quite unexpectedly, all of the chiefs of the village assembled and said that they were going to give me a title, an important title of the village. This title is Longona Itanga, which literally means heard at the tree felling, and it is the title of the heir apparent of the high chief of the village. At that time, I was quite young too, I was only 24. They bestowed that title. It took up all of my supplies, which I had to give to them, supplies for a 3-month stay. But from that time on, because I held this title, I was given recognition throughout the village, and I had the right to sit in the Council of Chiefs, which I promptly did, and to attend all of their courts. And it was then that the information that was being brought unmistakably before me that I began to realize that many of the things that Margaret Mead had reported in coming of age in Samoa certainly did not accord with what I was witnessing in Sa'anapu.
In 1943, Derek Freeman leaves Samoa to join the Navy. Later in the 1940s, he studies the Iban, a head-hunting people of central Borneo. He then becomes a professorial fellow at the Australian National University, and it is not until 1965 that he returns to Samoa for 2 years to continue his research. During the 1930s and over the next 40 years, Margaret Mead's reputation continues to grow. She becomes the recipient of numerous honorary degrees and awards. At some point in the 1960s, the world thrusts on Mead's shoulders what is described as a mantle of omniscience, which she accepts as her due and wears with a flourish. It goes well with her forked staff and cape, and adds to her mystique as a superwoman who knows everything, and who also, knowledge being power, can do anything. She becomes indisputably the most publicly celebrated scientist in America, and one of the most revered women of all time.
I knew Margaret very well for, I think, a period of 23 years. I, of course, did field work with her for several years in Manus, in New Guinea. And I was also part of her small group that she referred to as her family. Now, one thing Margaret was, she was an excellent lecturer, a fantastic entertainer and speaker. She really was an enchantress, and she could really cast a spell. She never failed to mesmerize me. Even after many years I knew her, I would sit in the audience and I'd watch her absolutely spellbound and wondered, how do you become like that? Absolutely incredibly gifted in this way. And I think that's what, I mean, after a while, it didn't matter what Margaret said. She said a lot of interesting things. She said a lot of very foolish things. And sometimes she gave the position of being avant-garde when she really wasn't avant-garde.
Margaret Mead visited the Australian National University in 1964. And in November of that year, we had a long private meeting in my study in the Research School of Pacific Studies. I laid before her all of the evidence that I had that indicated that her conclusion was not empirically justified. She was very much taken aback by this and subsequently reported that she felt that her results were now under threat. But when I wrote to her saying that although our conclusions differed, I hoped that there would be no bad feeling between us and that I would strive to see that there was not, she wrote back to me from New York in December 1964 saying, "Anyway, what matters is the work." And I thought that was an exemplary reply.
My mother knew about Freeman, the particular kind of personality he has, the fact that he has sometimes been somewhat unpredictable, and she was worried about it. She was worried that he might behave in a way that would be damaging to anthropology and damaging to the people of Samoa.
You see, when you were dealing with a matter like this, Margaret Mead's conclusion in coming of age in Samoa had become established doctrine in universities throughout America. Now, I well realized that attempting to undo that was a very formidable task indeed, and I had to go about it most thoroughly. And it was only when I had assembled the evidence that I felt by March 1978 that I was in a position to do it. But very soon after that, Margaret Mead unfortunately died. And I then realized that there must be a pause, there must be a decent pause between her death and the publication of the refutation. And I still, at any rate, had to seek certain evidence in Samoa and Honolulu.
In 1981, at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu, Freeman completes the evidence for his refutation, and in 1982 he accepts an offer of publication by Harvard University Press. But before the book is released, Edwin McDowell, a journalist from the New York Times, picks up the story.
The next thing I knew was that one morning while I was having a bath here, the telephone rang, and I got up and went to the telephone unclad. Quite naked, and there was Ewan McDowell on the telephone. I'd never heard of him before, and I talked to him for about 40 minutes. And on the 31st of January, it was on the front page of the New York Times. And then the furore began.
The anthropologists were stunned by the New York Times article and stunned again by the immediate press attention to it. We're talking about dispatches that were printed in literally hundreds of newspapers throughout the United States, not on one day, but for day after day. It had the kind of attention that presidential candidates or presidents are accustomed to have, altogether unusual for an academic subject. And they didn't have the book. They had no indication that such a book was in progress, and nor, when it was announced, had anybody heard of Derek Freeman. Who is Derek Freeman? And it looked like a case in which the most honored anthropologist in history indeed one of the most honored Americans and academics in history, was to be slain by an obscure David somewhere out in the Antipodes. Coming of Age Samoa was a classic textbook for undergraduate teaching. Millions, who knows, 5, 10 million Americans may have read that as undergraduates in universities. And of course it was taught to them as being true. And then along comes Derek Freeman and says it's all false.
What Derek did, you see, was a double whammy. He didn't just attack it in a theoretical way. He attacked it in the person of the goddess, of the super celebrity who had made anthropology, who was anthropology, who was the symbol of anthropology to the world, and who was the prime promulgator of this doctrine to the world on behalf of anthropology. So he did a thing that was doubly bad. He didn't just say, you know, this religion is theologically problematical. He said God is wrong. Or rather, in this case, the goddess is wrong. She couldn't be, you see. She couldn't be, because if she was wrong, then the doctrine was wrong, then the whole liberal humanitarian scheme was wrong. I think this is a wrong connection. I think the liberal wing here made a wrong connection. You don't need that position in order to defend the goodness of man. But they do, and they did.
One of the leading anthropologists came out immediately after the first word of Derek's book was out and said, I haven't read the book, but I know he's wrong. That's a bit depressing in a field that thinks it's a science.
The controversy of nature-nurture was an important one which should have been dealt with in his book, but wasn't dealt with because he was so interested in ruining the reputation that Margaret Mead had built on her Samoa work.
I think that there was a kind of spirit of, oh boy, let's do some debunking. That'll be fun. That ended when people realized that this wasn't just Margaret Mead bashing, that this was an attack on the fundamental ideas of the discipline.
I've had some anthropologists say to me that it wasn't good for the discipline as a whole. And I said, why not? Why not? If we can't stand scrutiny, then what are we worried about? I'm not worried about being scrutinized. Saying, yeah, so, well, that was wrong. So look at everything we've done right.
This came at a time when there was a backlash on cultural determinism or explaining things in terms of environment in this country. It was a political backlash. Out comes this book which supports a right-wing political backlash and gives reason why, in fact, we should be following biologically based national policies. So that's extremely threatening. I'm not sure he was aware of that he was used or could have been used if his book had sold.
Well, I'm a little concerned as a university professor because some of my students tell me that in their anthropology classes, they are almost actively discouraged from reading Freeman's book, which I find absolutely extraordinary. Because I have heard anthropology colleagues speak critically of Margaret Mead, but it's as though they are frightened that their discipline will come under discredit by this book, and let's face it, I think they're a little nervous about getting grants.
It so happened that in November 1983, in Science 83, which is a publication of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, my book was rated as the most important book of the year in the social sciences and recommended for holiday reading. Now, at this very time, the American Anthropological Association was meeting in Chicago, its annual meeting. And there, the opposition to my refutation was so intense that a motion was passed condemning the book as unscientific and as possessing all other kinds of defects. And they then voted on it. This is a quite extraordinary event because the scientific truth is something that cannot be settled politically. It's something that depends on the evidence. And I realized when this news reached me that my refutation, in fact, had been a great success because it had prompted these people into this quite extraordinary reaction.
American anthropologists knew very little about Derek Freeman as a person and didn't realize what they were taking on. I think they felt a few dismissive reviews, and he would curl up and die and go away and retire back to Poga Poga or Bonga Bonga or wherever it was he'd come from. They didn't realize they were taking on a very, very tough character. I mean, anyone who knows Derek knows that when he has got his teeth into something, he does not let go. He is going to get it right, though the heavens fall. So American anthropology suddenly found itself with this one-man tornado taking it on. And for every 20 indignant letters or articles, the American anthropologists or speeches, Derek came back with 20 more equally powerful. And I think this has rather shaken them. I think they weren't prepared for something of this magnitude. They just thought he'd go away. Well, Derek doesn't just go away.
In 1973, Richard Goodman, a student of Samoa for many years, writes his own independent refutation of Mead's book. He arrives at many of the same conclusions that Freeman reaches.
Well, what I uncovered was that Samoans have a huge amount of aggression in them due to the way they're brought up as children, treated as children, punished as children, that they repress this aggression and anger, that they displace it. It comes out in very interesting and peculiar ways. They simply aren't that happy. They have a mask of happiness.
In the area in Samoa that I lived, there was one occasion of extraordinary violence, which happened in the national cricket tournament in Apia, in the capital city. Our team went to the cricket tournament, and they were not doing very well in the cricket tournament, and they thought they should be doing better. In one game, they became enraged by the referee's calls. They thought they were biased, and the crowd began yelling, "Kill the ref," and they did. They beat him to death with their cricket bats. One occurrence that I have read about, I believe it was in 1928, a very similar occurrence happened in Apia in the national cricket tournament, when a referee was beaten to death by the players with their cricket bats for bad calls. Exactly the same thing that happened in 1982.
When I was in Samoa in 1967, I was astonished to find that an American anthropologist, Lowell Holmes, had claimed that Mead's conclusions about Samoa were remarkably reliable. I had a copy of his PhD thesis. In fact, he had sent me a copy of it. I then wrote to him and pointed out that the information contained in this thesis on rape and various other things directly contradicted Margaret Mead. And I asked him how this possibly could be, that when his own evidence contradicted her, he could claim that her conclusions were remarkably reliable. And he wrote back to me in 1967 saying that he agreed that Margaret found pretty much what she wanted to find, and that he disagreed with various of her conclusions, but he was forced by his faculty advisor to soften his criticisms. And in the same letter, Holmes added, the only tragedy about Mead is that she still refuses to admit that she might have been wrong on her first field trip. Now, it was this extraordinary confession of Holmes that was, among other things, as far as I was concerned, a quite important reason why I should proceed with my refutation.
I don't believe that Margaret Mead was wrong on her first field trip. And the letter that I wrote to Derek Freeman, where he claims that I said that Margaret seems to find whatever she wants to, is what I wrote him. This is true. At the time, however, Margaret had just written a very terrible review about a book of mine, and I was pretty upset at her. I wrote this to Derek Freeman, not believing that it would appear again and again and again in print. I thought this was confidential correspondence. And I still stand by it. And I've had 4 field trips to the area. And I still stand by my statement that I believe that her description of Samoan culture and Samoan behavior was very good. I believe that she did a very credible job. And I think that many of the complaints that have been brought against her work by Derek Freeman are unfair.
Since the publication of my refutation, Holmes has become Mead's principal champion. At the beginning of 1987, he published a book called The Quest for the Real Samoa Beyond the Mead-Freeman Controversy. And in this book, he has evasively changed the conclusion that Mead reached.
Dr. Holmes, how can you possibly still consider Mead's work to be correct in view of the so many contradictions between her work and yours, and even contradictions within Mead's book itself?
I think that there are contradictions in Mead's book. I think that the society was perhaps a bit more complex than she pictured it. After all, this young woman was 23 years old. I think she probably made some mistakes. I think that she had perhaps a kind of a romantic view of the South Seas. Margaret Mead did distort the situation a little bit. Her picture of village life is a kind of a romantic one. What she did, she took typical activities that might occur throughout an entire year and sort of jammed them all into one day, giving the impression that a Samoan village is a very busy, bustling kind of place. I imagine this is a kind of artist license, and I don't know whether artist license is permitted anthropologists. I think that Coming of Age in Samoa was written for a popular audience. I think that the last chapter was added at the request of the publisher. I don't think that that necessarily affected the data that came before it, but I think that it may have affected some of the conclusions that she drew at the end.
Well, Margaret Mead went into the field and she talked to adolescent girls, and she came back with a view of Samoans as being gentle and living an idyllic life of having sex before marriage, as being able to try different things and not having the stresses and strains of American adolescence during the same period of life. Derek Freeman went in and he talked to the chiefs, and he came back with a view of Samoan life as being aggressive, and Samoans having a high rape rate, and being almost the exact opposite of what Margaret Mead had described. And so you could argue that that he was doing exactly what she was doing, except that he was 66 years old and she was 23 years old. He was doing what I call historical tracking. He was picking data out of different periods over long periods of time without concern for the changes that had happened during those periods. Not only the changes in terms of the Americans that were coming and going, but the modernization, the technology that was coming in, the schooling and how that was affecting people. It was all as if it were one period for him.
From what I have seen in Western Samoa and the people that I've talked to and what I've read about the debate, I don't see any significant difference in the society and people's behavior in 1928 between Western Samoa and Ta'u.
According to Mead, adolescence in Samoa is a period of promiscuity before marriage. Freedom of sexual experimentation is encouraged and even expected, with a girl distributing her favours among many youths adept in amorous techniques. But all other ethnographers report that both premarital and extramarital sex are strictly prohibited by Samoan custom. They describe the Samoans as a devoutly Christian people with a very severe sexual morality that was even stronger during Mead's time in Samoa. How then is Mead's account of free love in Samoa to be explained?
There's a double standard in Samoa. The young men have two objects. One of them is to have sexual relations with the girls as much as they can. The other one is to make sure their sisters don't have sexual relations with the other guys in the village. And a girl leads a very guarded, protected life.
Aside from just opinions of various people who were there or not, I find it extraordinary that people don't mention what Margaret Mead just passed off in her book, is that there were no pregnancies, which she admits in her book. None of these girls that she claims are engaging in sex ever got pregnant. And I find that to be extraordinary. In fact, she doesn't document any premarital pregnancies in any of the villages that she worked in. And I can't imagine that young girls who were presumably fertile, that she documents their fertility essentially in her book, that they weren't getting pregnant. And if they don't, I assume that there wasn't sex going on.
Could Margaret Mead have allowed herself to be fooled by the Samoan girls, on whom she relied completely for information?
Put yourself in the position of a teenage girl in an American colony which has been heavily Christianized by somewhat puritanical missionaries. And you know what puritanical missionaries are mostly concerned with. Once they got rid of headhunting, they want to get rid of anything like promiscuous sex or extramarital sex. Put yourself in the position of those teenage girls, and you have this rather ambiguous American woman, ambiguous in the political sense that she's hobnobbing both with government officials and with missionaries. And then she's trying to make cozy friends with you, and then starts asking you about your menarche and about your boyfriends and about how you get engaged and what do you do when you go in the bushes. I think you're just setting yourself up in any society, but surely in a society like that, you're setting yourself up for people telling you what they think you want to hear.
What comes through for me as I read over the material is the kind of warm, informal, day after day relationship that she had with those teenage girls. I think the idea of a systematic, sustained distortion is extremely implausible.
One of the main forms of entertainment in a Samoan village is what I call recreational line, which has several terms, tafa or tafa lili, and it's the old pulling people's legs, pimping people. It's a basic sort of locker room humor from junior high school. All ages engage in it. And people tell you stories to try and get you to believe it, and then they sort of chuckle inside. And it happens continually. My friends used to do this to me all the time. And often it's about sexual matters, because Samoans appear to me to be very uptight about sex, and that's the thing that always brings a laugh. They say things about sex that they don't mean.
Perhaps in this controversy, the Samoans themselves hold the answer, and their evidence is of crucial significance.
Well, I went to the University of Hawaii in 1948 to take some courses in the University of Hawaii. And it was during an anthropology class that I realized something was being taught that was not in accordance with our way of life and culture. And during this anthropology class, I got up and objected to Professor Mason, who was the instructor. Told him I do not believe, and I did not believe at that time, to what Margaret Mead was saying in her book about the sex life of the Samoan young people. And he said to me, "How do you know?" And he said, "Well, I should know. I grew up in that culture. I am of the age Margaret Mead is writing about." And that is not true.
Margaret Mead was in here in 1926. So she stayed at Mrs. Guest House as one of the chiefs over here. I usually help her with carrying her mosquito net, typewriters, and some folders for her work. I think some girl told her a wrong story. The Samoan people, wants to laugh to a foreigner or somebody, so they told them the wrong story to influence her to listen to the story, but but it's not a true story.
Ta'u Island, the very place where Margaret Mead studied adolescence in Samoa. A terrible hurricane devastated the island in 1987. Remarkably, a search for Mead's adolescent girls of the 1920s leads to the discovery, more than 60 years later, of Mead's close associate and chief informant, 86-year-old Fa'apua'a Fa'amu. Her account will settle once and for all the controversy that has long surrounded Margaret Mead's coming of age in Samoa.
Fa'amu, ol mele ol fisiri mua lava. Pe manatua oi Margaret Mead, po olale ko inga kinge. Ola ngi me ke mankua au ngai Margaret Mead ko fewai.
Fewai. Te mantua ale le o te nei ata ita te le ni si tu intanga tawa o le ar mama ftanga. Ma fewai le a pe ora le uso tasi. Ai ata silan me awai ai va anua. Ala fora ma o fo me o tangi fa me la uma na me o ia fa me la fo me tu la fa. Ai fa me tau po ma u. E ave fa me tau po. Ya wa e mua la manga o fu mo senga mo siri. A pena foi tu u.
Animu. Dai xa so foi le po se fia fie.
Na.
E pe filia ku le fine po a me o e fai po. I se skemi pe u la foi o ko pe.
Yo e a tu la ma tu te e va matama mo le lunga le ula ya la va tu fa mo ia. Yo e a fa me e tu e fe ma tu eva. Eva mai ia ma tu fe ia e ma fo lo tira. Eva matama ya ela va tu fa mo ila ia o me ula we lo fuiti ni Samoa tele le pipelo ma le ula ia ia va tu la fa mo e va fa mo ila makilika ila me mo
e kela kai mi ke e fsile ka ya ka limo ale o kai mi avo le pelo yo ko ya Margaret Mead
yo el pipelo ia ma tu.
Well, if Margaret Mead was wrong, where do you think she got her ideas from? Do you think she was fooled by her young informants?
No, my view on this may be a bit harsh, but I think Margaret Mead was talking about her own self. I think she brought her own ideas. She was just looking for a frame. But she brought her own ideas and her own problems from the United States of America. And from her own self.
I think she made up her mind that she's going to write that theory according to what she believed, but not according to what the people are living here. Because the whole book is just totally opposing our own custom and culture, the way we live, the way we protect our young girls.
Margaret Mead took away our, perhaps not our humanity so much, as our oneness with other human beings. I mean, we're no different from you in Australia or the United States or any other part of the world. We all go through these phases, and perhaps it's our cultures that makes the semblance of difference. But for Margaret Mead to make us behave as if we are non-humans because we behave like animals in our promiscuity, I think that is a very great disfavor that she has done us.
We have one more question from Saini.
Yes, Dr. Mead. I would like to ask you, why did you choose to visit Samoa at this time, but not, let's say, 5 or 10 years right after you wrote the book 46 years ago?
Well, I think the real answer is, that, or there are 2 or 3 answers. One, lots of other people came to work in Samoa. Younger students, and they came to talk to me before they went, and I talked to them when they came back. We began having moving pictures, so that I saw pictures every few years, lots of still pictures. I knew what was happening. I've seen pictures of what's been going on Ta'u for years.
I find it very curious that Margaret Mead never really returned to Samoa. Apparently she once sat down there for an hour or so to open a power station or something. But she went back to other places to recheck what had happened, but never to Samoa. And I think this is very curious. My own hypothesis is that she was frightened. That she was frightened that she might find material that contradicted her first book. And after all, her fame was established by that first book. And I think she was so insecure that she was afraid that if anything in that book was discredited, her whole reputation would fall into shreds.
She told me that she had met with Derek Freeman and that he had told her about his research in Samoa and what he thought of her work and that he was going to publish this. And I gave her a so what look. And she said, you don't understand. He has proven me wrong. And she looked very sad and puzzled, and I thought it was very odd that I was here feeling sorry for Margaret Mead, and even stranger that I was going to have to tell her that this was not important. But I did. I said, what you have done in anthropology and for the world is not Samoa dependent. It really doesn't matter whether you were right or wrong about Samoa. And she said, well, what do you think I ought to do about it? I said, just nothing.
Well, as a result of this whole controversy, Samoa is a place that has assumed immense anthropological and human significance. I have often said that if only we Westerners can understand the Samoans, then we can understand ourselves. And we should be thankful that Samoa was a place where issues of such great scientific importance could be studied and resolved. Samoa is a profoundly important place to me. I mean, that's where I began to think deeply about these problems. And I have an enormous debt of gratitude to the Samoans. I become very emotional when I go to Samoa because my bond with the Samoans is so deep. And I have a great love and regard for them. But this does not mean to say that I suppose that they are stainless or that they are gods or goddesses. They are marvelous human beings.
O te wha moi moi lava, o le a tātou tū mau pēa I le wha maoni mā le alofa, e o le wha wawau. Pau lea. Pena tō le whawolo mōna e whaiaia.
My passion in life is that we will develop a genuine science of the human species. Nothing is more important for humans than that we succeed in that task. Now, I have said that the question that Bowers gave Margaret Mead to answer was a profoundly important anthropological question. And I think that now, in the late 1980s, we have resolved that problem. It is apparent to all knowledgeable behavioral scientists that we must operate within a framework in which we simultaneously take into account our evolutionary history and our cultures. And it is only when these two things are combined within an interactionist paradigm that you have the imperative precondition for a genuine science of our species? Well, I have always been a heretic. I think being a heretic is the most beautiful thing, because this comes from a Greek root meaning someone who chooses for himself. In other words, a heretic is someone who thinks for himself and doesn't run with the mob. And I have always been a heretic and found great joy in it. But what you've got to be in science is a heretic who gets it right. It's no use being a heretic who gets it wrong, because then you're a pariah dog in their eyes. But if you are a heretic who gets it right, you can't do better.